There is a drawer, steel, shallow, the kind that slides out of a cabinet in the back rooms of a museum where the public never goes. On the front is a small typed card. The card has a number, a place, a year. Behind the card, the drawer is empty. I wasn't looking for the drawer. I was reading 19th century newspapers for something else entirely, a question about old county roads, when I started noticing the same sentence, over and over, in papers from a dozen different states. A farmer ploughs a low hill. The hill turns out to be a mound. Inside the mound, bones, and the bones are too long, 7 feet, 8, once, in a Tennessee account, 18. And nearly every story ends the same way. The remains, it says, were sent to the Smithsonian for study. That's the line I couldn't stop seeing. Sent to the Smithsonian. Sometimes it's a county sheriff who ships them, sometimes a railroad surveyor. The bones leave the field, they enter the institution, and then the sentence stops. There is no next sentence, no catalogue number you can pull, no drawer you can open and find them in. By 1900 you can count at least 11 states where a newspaper printed some version of this. Ohio, West Virginia, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Tennessee. The real number is higher, I'll come back to that. So here is the question I started with, and it is smaller and stranger than the one you think I'm asking. Not, were there giants? That comes later. The first question is just this. Where do the sentences go when they stop? The mainstream answer is not a cover-up, and it is mostly correct. By the time anthropologists looked hard at these stories, they had a tidy and largely accurate explanation. The giant skeletons of American newspapers were a mixture of hoaxes, honest mistakes, and the heated imagination of a press that sold papers by the column inch. Some were outright frauds. In 1869, 2 men buried a 10-foot figure carved from gypsum on a farm near Cardiff, New York, dug it up in front of a paying crowd, and watched the country lose its mind. The Cardiff Giant, still the most famous archaeological hoax in American history. Others were real bones, badly read, the leg of a mastodon, the tusk of a mammoth, the skull of an extinct bison, measured by men who had never studied anatomy and wanted very much to believe. And the believing mattered. A farmer who finds a big bone in his field has found a curiosity. A farmer who finds a giant has found a story the New York Times will print with his name in it. The square cube law, the simple physics that a body scaled to 12 feet would shatter its own thigh bones under its own weight, was not something a county newspaper paused to consider. All of that is true. The Smithsonian's own anthropologists said it for decades. Ales Hrdlicka, the institution's curator of physical anthropology, blamed the whole genre on what he called the will to believe. That is true as far as it goes. It is incomplete in ways that matter, because the official story explains the bones. It does not explain the story the bones were recruited into, and that story is the one somebody actually had a reason to bury. To find it, you have to leave the giants for a moment and look at the dirt they came out of. The mounds are real. That part was never in question. Across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, there once stood tens of thousands of earthworks burial mounds, flat-topped platforms, geometric enclosures so precise that surveyors drew them like cathedrals. At Cahokia, near present-day Street Louis, one mound covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid. The people who raised them moved earth by the basket load, by the million basket, over centuries. And from the first decades of the American Republic, the educated men who measured these mounds asked one question about them, with a strange, hungry insistence. Who could possibly have built this? Not the Native Americans they could see around them. That answer was, for them, unthinkable. So they invented a different one, a vanished race. A superior people, older and nobler than any living tribe, who built the mounds in their golden age and were then wiped out, leaving the land conveniently empty for its rightful inheritors to find. This is not fringe history. It has a name in the academic literature, the mound-builder myth. And here is the number that should stop you. In 1894, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, the government's scientific arm for studying native peoples, published a single report on the mounds, 730 pages. The author was a man named Cyrus Thomas. He had spent more than a decade and federal money surveying the earthworks for exactly this question. He had started, by his own account, believing in the lost race. He ended somewhere else. His report concluded there was, in his words, an unbroken chain connecting the mound builders and the historical Indians. The builders were the ancestors of the people already here. The director who hired him, John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran who first ran the Bureau, had already dismissed the lost race idea as a romantic fallacy. So by 1894, the United States government's own scientists had said, in print, in 730 pages, there was no vanished super race. Native Americans built the mounds. Which raises a harder question than any giant. If the institution had already proven the myth false, why did the myth refuse to die? And why, a century later, would that same institution be accused of the exact opposite of what it actually did? Start with who benefited. A myth survives when enough people, for their own separate reasons, need it to. Nobody has to meet in a room. In the 19th century, the idea of a vanished white race of mound builders was useful to almost everyone with power, and useful in the most practical way imaginable. It was an argument about land. If the ancestors of living Native Americans had built the great earthworks, had farmed, governed, engineered, buried their dead under monuments, then they were a settled, accomplished people with a deep and rightful claim to the continent. That is an inconvenient thing to believe while you are removing those same people from that same land at gunpoint. But if some other race built the mounds, a noble lost people whom the so-called savages had supposedly destroyed, then the moral arithmetic flips. The Native Americans stop being the builders of America's first cities and become the destroyers of them. And taking land back from destroyers is not theft, it is restoration. It is almost a duty. This is not my inference. It is the documented spine of a recent University of Oklahoma Press history of the myth, which lays out how the lost race story threaded through the rhetoric of manifest destiny, and how figures from Andrew Jackson to William Henry Harrison leaned on some version of it. The myth was not a harmless campfire tale. It was infrastructure. It moved fence lines. It signed removals. Now hold that beside the giants, and the giants stop looking like a separate mystery. A vanished super race needs to look super. Make the lost builders taller than living men, give them double rows of teeth and skulls a head too large, and you have proof, in bone, that these were not ordinary people, certainly not the ancestors of anyone you intend to displace. The giant in the mound was never just a tall skeleton. It was the myth's best witness. Every 8-foot frame in a county paper was, whether the editor knew it or not, a small deposit into a very large account. Here is the irony I cannot get past. The institution that finally closed that account, that published 730 pages proving the builders were native ancestors, that sent Cyrus Thomas into the field for a decade to kill the lost race, is the Smithsonian. The single body that did the most documented work to dismantle the giant race story is the one now accused, online, of having hidden it. And that accusation has a birthday. On the 3rd of December, 2014, a website called World News Daily Report published an article announcing that a U.S. Supreme Court ruling had forced the Smithsonian to admit it had destroyed thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s. It spread across the world. It is still spreading. There is only one detail worth knowing about World News Daily Report. At the bottom of its own pages, it states plainly that its content is fiction. The site is satire. There was no ruling. There were no declassified papers. The Smithsonian's chief spokesperson has said directly that no such destruction happened, and Reuters, the Associated Press, PolitiFact, and Snopes have each, separately, traced the entire modern cover-up legend back to that one satirical post. So the leaked Supreme Court documents came from a publication that labels itself fictional. That is the irony, and it is a bitter one, because the joke worked too well. Now the honest objection, and it is a good one. None of this proves every single newspaper account was false. It doesn't. Some of those 19th century reports describe bones, sent somewhere, never catalogued, impossible now to check. The skeptic is right that we cannot examine what was never properly recorded. But sit with what that objection actually concedes. It admits the record is full of holes. It just locates the hole somewhere ordinary in careless county clerks and a sloppy century rather than in a vault. And the ordinary explanation is almost certainly the correct one. That's the part people miss. The cover-up was real. It just wasn't the bones. It was the builders. Think about Cyrus Thomas for a moment, because almost no one does. He was an Illinois man. A Lutheran minister first, then a lawyer, then a self-taught naturalist who studied insects, locusts, mostly before John Wesley Powell handed him the mounds in 1881. He was not a radical. He began the survey, he later admitted, expecting to find the lost race like everyone else. He had the same instincts as his century. Then he did the work. For more than 10 years his crews opened mound after mound across the eastern United States, and the dirt kept telling him the same thing, and he was honest enough to listen. He wrote it down, 730 pages of it. He published the conclusion the country did not want, in the plainest language he could manage, under the seal of the federal government. The people who built these monuments were the ancestors of the Native Americans still living a few miles from the digs. He was right. We now know he was right. And it changed almost nothing in the popular mind. The lost race went on selling books. The giants went on growing in the papers. A century later, a satirical website would put his own institution's name on the very crime he had spent a decade disproving, and millions would believe the website over the man. He died in 1910. There is no monument to him on any mound. And that drawer, the steel one, the empty one with the typed card on the front, I keep returning to it because I understand now what the card was always pointing at, not a giant. It was pointing at a name we already had in 730 pages and chose not to read. The drawer was never empty. We just refused to see what was in it. The number on that card even has a name in museum work, an accession number, from a Latin root meaning to take a thing to yourself, to fold it into your own. We took the land. We took the credit for building it. We couldn't be bothered, in the end, to take the bones. Once you see the shape, you find it everywhere, wearing different clothes. The Bat Creek stone, pulled from a Tennessee mound in 1889, and read for a century as proof that ancient Old World travelers, not Native Americans, built the earthworks. The Davenport tablets in Iowa inscribed slabs that turned out to be a local hoax aimed squarely at the same lost race fantasy. The Kensington runestone in Minnesota, the Grave Creek stone in West Virginia, different states, different decades, different props, and underneath each one the identical engine. A need to award the deepest American past to anyone at all, other than the people who were actually here. Each case has its own ordinary explanation. A forger, a prank, a credulous editor, a museum that wanted a marvel. Pull any single thread and it comes away clean. Together they describe something else, a 100-year reflex to look at the greatest works on the continent and insist a vanished stranger must have made them. And the reflex did not retire. It changed medium. The same impulse that needed 8-foot skeletons in 1882 needed in 2014 a fictional Supreme Court ruling, and got it from a website that prints satire on its own masthead, and watched it outrun every correction. That is the modern cost, and it is not abstract. We now live inside an economy that pays, in clicks and in dollars, for exactly this, a marvelous lie that travels, against a true and complicated record that sits still. The lie about the Smithsonian hiding giants has earned more attention in 10 years than Cyrus Thomas earned in a lifetime of being correct. None of these records are hidden. They are simply never placed side by side and read in order. And they can be. Thomas's 1894 report sits in the Smithsonian's own digital repository, free, tonight. The Bureau of American Ethnology's papers are in the National Anthropological Archives. The newspaper accounts of giants, every breathless one, are searchable in the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database, and a researcher named Jason Colavito has spent years transcribing them in one place, so anyone can read what the papers actually said and what they quietly left out. The evidence was never locked. It was only scattered, and we are very bad at reading scattered things in the right order. That is the real suppression. Not a vault, a habit of attention, a century-long preference for the story that flatters us over the record that corrects us. So here is what was actually buried, and it is heavier than any giant. Not bones, a people's authorship. The plain fact that the first monumental architecture on this continent, cities of earth raised over 1,000 years, was the work of the ancestors of the people we were at that very moment. Driving off the land. We took the land twice, once with treaties and soldiers, once with a story that erased who had shaped it. The giants were the set dressing for that second theft, and they worked so well that 2 centuries later their ghost is still the version most people half remember. While the 730-page truth gathers dust in a repository, almost no one opens. That is the loss. Not a cheaper future or a lost technology. Something quieter. A correct answer we have held since 1894 and still cannot make travel as fast as a lie. Some of it can't be recovered now. The bones that 19th century farmers really did dig up and ship off without a catalogue number, those are gone. Not into a vault, but into the ordinary dark of bad record keeping, and we will never get to ask them anything. That hole stays open. It always will. If you want histories built this way, from the document up, the official account taken seriously and then tested against the record, stay with this channel. There is more of this than anyone has put in order. But I'll leave you with the thing I still can't answer. The myth was disproven in 1894. The institution accused of hiding the truth is the one that found it. Every fact-checker has filed the verdict. And still, tonight, somewhere, that empty drawer is being shown to someone as proof of the wrong crime, and they believe it. So the question was never whether there were giants in the ground. The question is why we so badly need there to have been. I don't think the records can answer that one. I think only we can.